It is a great pleasure for me to provide this presentation for you. The topic of my presentation will be Microbial Food Safety and Food Safety Modernization Act. I divided my presentation into three sections. The first part of my presentation, I briefly discuss my existing program in Nashville in the Cooperative Extension Program of Tennessee State University. And then I briefly talk about the importance of food safety. And then the last part of my presentation would be about a Food Safety Modernization Act. So very briefly, in a nutshell about my existing program, I received my training in food safety and food microbiology from Colorado State University. I had a chance to live in Colorado for close to 10 years, and between my graduate degrees there, I had a chance to work with these food companies in northern Colorado. And after those opportunities, I decided to go back to a school in Yale School of Public Health and receive additional training in epidemiology and food and drug regulatory affairs. And since 2015, I came to Tennessee State University and I established the Public Health Microbiology program. Everything that I'm going to discuss today and most of the recent progress that we have made is available on our website. If you go to publichealthmicrobiology.education, you could access many of the information that I'm discussing today. Here we can see the funding that we have received in recent years from different funding agencies, and every year we received $7,000 from extension program of Tennessee State University that we are very grateful of. And these are the current members of the program. Currently, there are 3 graduate students working in the program, and also a technician, an intern for making our websites, and also a postdoc and a visiting scholar is currently working in the program. And last fall, we had 3 students graduating from Public Health Microbiology program. This is definitely a success story. One of our graduate students, when she was finishing her degree, she received the position Tennessee Leader of Tomorrow internship in Tennessee Department of Agriculture. And this is not an isolated case. This slide, I try to summarize some of the achievement of the students from my program. Again, if you click on this web link, it will have additional information about their recent progress. But in a nutshell, last year they were first, second, and third in Tennessee Academy of Science competitions. And also we had the best PhD student in the college selected from our program some time ago. And in addition to my research and extension responsibilities, I teach a graduate course. As you can see, these are some of the comments and feedback that I receive from my students and stakeholders who come to my certification workshop. And also I had a great pleasure of teaching internationally in South Africa, in Dominican Republic, in Guatemala. And this year via Zoom, we are having a similar program in Haiti as well. Again, if you click on this web link, you could see the international activities of this program as well. With that brief introduction, I will talk briefly about food safety and importance of microbial food safety for public health. As you know, every 10 minutes or so, microbes replicate their genome. And most of the times they do this perfectly, but in rare cases, they make mistakes when they are replicating their genome. Most of the times, those mistakes are very costly. They don't survive those mistakes. But in rare cases, those mistakes in replication of their genome give them a benefit, give them an advantage. So because of this mechanism, scientists call it vertical gene transfer mechanism. Microbes are constantly moving towards diversity, towards fitness. So we don't need to do anything just on their own. In the nature, they are always evolving. They're always moving towards diversity and fitness. So it is expected for us to see new challenges and new opportunities within our lifetime because of this mechanism. In addition to that, there are more complicated mechanisms that we discuss in our classes. In short, scientists call them horizontal gene transfer mechanism. For example, when a bacteria is dead, the genome material will be in the environment, and another bacteria could go and pick up those genome material. Or a virus could infect the bacteria and then could transfer pieces of DNA to another bacteria. Or sometimes just by connection, microbes could transfer genetic material with each other. So this is another reason that microbes are moving towards diversity and fitness. Obviously, it happens in the nature, and it happens we could do these things for research purposes in the labs as well. In addition to that, microbes are capable of forming biofilm. So once we have microbes on a surface, we could think of it almost like a small, simple city that they make for themselves, almost like a carpet of microorganisms. Just to show you the importance of biofilm, I'll share with you briefly a project that one of our outstanding graduate students completed. In this slide, we are seeing biofilm formation of Chronobacter sakazaki. It's a pathogen that caused 2 outbreaks in Tennessee, one in Memphis and one in Knoxville some time ago. And here we can see the log number of microbes. Obviously, it's on a log scale. So when we go from 9 to 8, it's 90% reduction. When we go from 9 to 7, it's 99% reduction. And here we can see the days of biofilm formation. So here on day 0, we put those nasty microbes on a surface, and then we expose them to sodium hypochlorite. Obviously, this is a very common sanitizer. They use it in hospitals, in homes, in food industry, in agriculture. And we are seeing that more than 2 log reduction, which means more than 99% of the microbes, we can remove them from the surface using this sanitizer. But as we are seeing the biofilm formation, now we have day 1, day 4, and day 7. So here we have 1 week mature biofilm. So day 0, we did not have any biofilm. We had the pathogens on the surface. We had those nasty microbes on the surface. Now after 7 days, we have 1 week mature biofilm. And we are using the same treatment. And as we can see, we are seeing some reduction of the pathogen, but still we have significant amount of bacteria available on the surface. And that shows that the treatment that was effective against these nasty microbes, it is less effective when microbes are forming biofilm. In addition to biofilm forming capacity, microbes, we are learning there are 2019, 2020 studies that microbes, to some extent, they can communicate with each other. They can release small molecules, and to some extent, they can communicate with each other. Scientists, they call it chrome sensing mechanism. So because of all these complexities that we discussed, because of vertical gene transfer mechanism, because of horizontal gene transfer mechanism, because of biofilm formation, and because of chrome sensing, microbial food safety and infectious diseases is a moving target. And it is estimated that we know only around 1% of microbial community. So within our lifetime, we are expected to see new challenges and also new opportunities for researchers and practitioners to solve those problems. So when we look at the classic epidemiological data from 1990s, they are indicating that close to 5,000 people die every year in the United States because of foodborne diseases. And when we look at more recent epidemiological data from Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they indicate close to 3,000 people are dying every year in the United States, and the cost of foodborne diseases to the economy is close to $77 billion. And around 30% of the population are considered at-risk population for foodborne diseases. In short, they call them the YOPIs, the very young, the old people, pregnant people, and people who are immunocompromised. Obviously, that means people who are having some underlying health complications. And when it goes to number of illness, fresh produce are the leading cause of foodborne diseases. Close to half of the diseases are associated with fresh produce. But when it goes to foodborne death, muscle foods, meat, and poultry products are cause of around 30% of the infectious diseases. And this is some information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from 1998 to 2015, there had been more than 18,000 outbreaks. Obviously, it means that more than one people are getting sick from the same bacteria associated with food. And Tennessee had around 300 outbreaks from 1998 to 2015. And maybe some of you guys are thinking perhaps these foodborne outbreaks, these foodborne issues are related to large companies, and small companies are not having these problems. So for some time, I was just hoping to share some data from small companies. And obviously, these are very difficult studies to conduct. Researchers go to small farms, obtain samples, and they are showing that, for example, in poultry operation, in small operations with less than 5,000 birds, there is 40% prevalence of salmonella in fecal samples, and around 1/3 of the feed samples are contaminated with the salmonella as well. And obviously, salmonella is one of the leading cause of foodborne diseases in the country. Another study shows free-range, small poultry operations. Final products in one farm, they had 64% of the final products contaminated with salmonella. In other study, in another operation, they saw close to 30% of the final products were contaminated with salmonella. And this is another study. It shows that after slaughtering in one company, it's a relatively small company, as we can see. They had 42% positivity of salmonella on the final products. And in the storage area, 71% of the samples were tested positive for these small operations. So I think it is fair to say that these food safety issues, these food safety challenges are associated with large companies and also associated with the small companies. And I think it is important to mention that our newest publication shows that these food safety challenges, these infectious diseases challenges are going to be even more important in future under the landscape of climate change. We are showing that every 1 degree increase in the environment, in the temperature of the environment, could lead to as high as 100,000 additional cases of salmonella. And under the current situation, if we don't change the lifestyle that we have, if we continue to produce greenhouse gases, it is expected in 20 years from now, we are going to see the planet getting warmer for around 1.5 degrees. So I think it is within our lifetime, most of us are going to see that this is just 20 years away. I think it is fair to say microbial food safety is very important now, and in future is going to be even more important under the landscape of climate change. Okay, the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about Food Safety Modernization Act. I think it is an extremely important legislation, and I try to summarize overview of this important legislation in few minutes. As we know, this was signed into law in 2011. And this is the largest piece of legislation related to food safety since 1930s. And it is the first time in the history of the country that many farmers and many manufacturers would need to do certain regulatory requirements that we are going to discuss briefly today. The overall purpose of Food Safety Modernization Act was to prevent the infectious diseases related to food and water supplies. As we talked earlier, close to 3,000 people die every year because of foodborne diseases, and this legislation aims to prevent additional death related to the food and agricultural commodities. And in short, this legislation give FDA broader abilities. There are 6 specific areas that FDA has additional responsibility because of Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, for the first time in the history of the country, Food and Drug Administration could initiate a recall. Before FSMA, they could suggest, they could recommend a recall. But now, because of FSMA, if they are seeing problems in the operation, if the food in the market is not safe, they could request, they could mandate a recall to the company or to the farmer. They are receiving additional funds to investigate foodborne diseases, and they're establishing traceability program, new preventive measures that we briefly discussed today. They have additional funding to do inspection, and also they are inspecting foreign companies, those that are selling a lot of food in the United States, FDA now has authority to investigate those companies further as well. I think this is an important slide. Before FSMA, there were some successful legislations related to food safety. For example, meat and poultry products. They were following a HACCP requirement, hazard analysis and critical control point requirement under the United States Department of Agriculture Food Safety Inspection Service Program. So those companies, they don't need to be worried about FSMA. For them, business will be as usual. They would need to follow the pre-existing regulatory requirement. Same thing for the juice industry, for the seafood and for the shell egg industry. They are still following the previous legislation. Again, it was hazard analysis, critical control point legislation that is mandated by Department of Health and Human Services under the jurisdiction of Food and Drug Administration. So again, those companies, for them, business would be as usual. But for the rest of the processors, food companies, and pretty much for remaining of the farmers in the country, for the companies that are doing transportation, for companies that are importing food, for the third-party labs, and also for the foreign governments and local, state, and federal agencies, there are new requirements under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Again, very briefly, we are going just to touch the surfaces, introduce the legislation for the stakeholders, and if there is additional information, if there is need for additional information, I would be enthusiastically available to work with our farmers and also with the local food manufacturers. FSMA, as we talked, it's a relatively large legislation. There are more than 50 different rules in this legislation. But 5, if you ask some researchers, they say 5 of them are extremely important. Some believe 6 of them are extremely important. They call these the 5 or the 6 pillars of food safety modernization. One of them is preventive control for human foods that we briefly discussed. I think it is extremely important. The other one is for foreign suppliers. Another very important rule in this legislation is about third-party auditors. An extremely important one is about produce safety that we are going to discuss briefly today. And 2 others are about international adulteration and also transportation of the food. So these are the 5 or 6 pillars of FSMA. Among 50 different rules in this legislation, these are the most important ones. And 2 of them, I think they are extremely important for the farmers and for the food companies. So we are going to briefly discuss them today. Before we talk about the legislation, I found this document a very helpful document. It's publicly available on the internet, and it was very easy to understand, especially if you would like to learn a little bit more about history of FSMA and how it became the law of the land. I think this person did an amazing job discussing it. And these are the 2 legislations that I think, one is for farmers, the other one is for food companies that I briefly discussed today. So one of the rules, one of the 6 important parts of FSMA, it is called Standards for Growing, Harvesting, Packing, and Holding of Produce for Human Consumption. Obviously, because the name is very long, in short, they call it the Produce Rule or Produce Safety Rule. And this is the rule for farmers, for the farming operation in the country. And then the second important legislation that we briefly discussed today is called Current Good Manufacturing Practice and Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Control for Human Food. Obviously, because the name is very long and very difficult to remember, in short, they call it Preventive Control for Human Food. And this is a legislation, this is a rule for food companies. And there's a similar rule for feed companies also, those companies that are obviously selling their products to the animal industry. And for larger companies, I think these legislations, still it's difficult for them to meet the requirements, but obviously they can hire additional people and meet the regulatory requirement. For the very small, for the extremely small, for the hobbyist, for the cottage industry, they could apply for exemption. I mean, there are some exemptions for all the rules that we discussed today. But I think these legislations are extremely important for small and medium-sized farms and also food companies. And I think that's where we can help in land grant institution, and they need material to make sure they are meeting the regulatory requirements. So I think our role, the role of land grant institution, is going to be even more important when it goes to the agricultural production and the food science. Okay, the first rule, the produce rule. It is regulating farms and farm type facilities. And to make a long and complicated story short, just to give the brief overview of the legislation, it divides all the fresh produce into three categories. One category is associated with the sprouts. Obviously, as we know, there were major outbreaks related to the sprouts in recent years. So they have very special, very specific requirements for safety of the sprout industry. Rest of the agricultural commodities, they divide them into two large categories. Obviously, the list is a target of change. It's a moving target, and they are trying to update that. But at this point, they call half of the fresh produce, half of the agricultural commodities, low risk produce. And these are the produce that consumers will have additional processes at home. Let's say potatoes, most consumers, obviously, they cook them, or pumpkins. Or if a farmer is making green beans, but they are selling the green bean to a canning industry. So if they have a kill step after production, these products will be considered a low-risk agricultural commodities. And if the product is considered low-risk, farmers are exempt from requirement of a Food Safety Modernization Act. But if the product they have, it doesn't have a kill step, I mean, these are the things that people purchase and consume them immediately, then their product is considered as a high-risk agricultural commodity. Things like tomatoes, leafy greens, berries, stone fruits. In that case, companies would need to follow the requirement, and farmers would need to follow the requirement of Food Safety Modernization Act. There are certification trainings available for this rule of the legislation, and most of the certification program are 1 day or 2 day program, and they discuss these topics. They talk workers training. I think it is extremely important. Their health and hygiene would need to be monitored and documented. I mean, it's easy to say it on paper, but for farmers, obviously, it's challenging, because not only they have to hire people, but they have to provide food safety training for them, and then they have to document that. They would need to be ready for audits from the FDA in case it happens. In addition to that, there are very specific requirements for water testing. It is going to start in 2021, and obviously this is the first time in history of the country that farmers would need to do water testing. So this is a source of anxiety for them. There are some technical issues, and it's going to be not cheap. It might be expensive to test their product. So I think it is another area that our programs, we have active microbiology labs, we could help the stakeholders for conducting an interpretation of these testing related to the Food Safety Modernization Act. And then there is a specific requirement for soil amendment. Obviously, they would need to come up with a validated method to assure that the products that they are using for soil amendment is not carrying pathogens. And then there are specific requirements for elimination of wild and domesticated animals from the operation, from the farming operation. And there are very specific requirements for documentation and cleaning of the equipment, tools, and buildings and facilities that are used for production of high-risk raw agricultural commodities. And then, as I mentioned, there is a very specific rule about production of a sprout as well. So farmers and companies that are producing a sprout and packaging them, they would need to meet certain additional regulatory requirements as well. So this part of the legislation was implemented in October of 2015. And the large companies, they had 2 years to meet the regulatory requirements. The small companies, the medium-sized companies, and they had 3 years to meet the regulatory requirement. And the small farms, they had 4 years to meet the regulatory requirement. And in near future, these companies would need to meet the regulatory requirement for water testing as well. Obviously, for testing the water, companies and farmers have 2 additional years to meet the regulatory requirement. And farmers with the 3-year average revenue of less than $25,000 are exempt from this legislation. Obviously, if 1 year their profit is 25,000, the other is 30, and then the last year is $25,000, if they are slightly above this limit, they could invest a little bit in their farm to make sure they are staying within the exemption box. But if their 3-year average revenue is more than $25,000 per year, then they would need to follow the requirement of the Food Safety Modernization Act. Okay, the last part of my presentation would be talking about another important rule of the legislation. In short, it is called Preventive Control for Human rule. And this is the legislation that is targeting food manufacturer. Obviously, as we mentioned, meat industry will remain under the previous legislation of hazard analysis and critical control point. Same thing for the seafood and juice industry. For them, business would be as usual, but for the rest of the food companies, they would need to follow the requirement of this part of the legislation. And this legislation, again, to make a complicated legislation easy to understand, the requirement for the legislation could be divided into 2 categories. One category is called GMP or good manufacturing practices. And these are relatively easy to follow. These are the practices that most food companies, they already have in place. So for companies, they could apply, for food companies, they could apply for modified exemption. And if they receive the modified exemption, all they would need to do is just to follow the good manufacturing practices. In order to receive the modified exemption, if they are selling less than $500,000 per year. And I would need to highlight that for the previous legislation, it was 3-year revenue. For this legislation is just the sale. If their sale is less than $500,000, and if they are selling their food locally within 275 miles of their operation, if they are selling directly to the restaurants, if they are selling directly to the consumers, they could apply for modified exemption. And if they are selling within the state and within 275 miles of their operation. And obviously these limits are for public health purposes. In case there is an outbreak, if it is a local food company, they could just go and recall the product, take care of the patients, they could do contact tracing. But if they are selling their products in larger audiences, or if their sale is more than $500,000, then they would need to comply with good manufacturing practices. And in addition to that, they would need to follow the requirement of the other part of the legislation that in short, it's called HARPC. So again, if companies could receive modified exemptions, all they would need to do is just good manufacturing practices. But if they are not exempt, if they cannot receive this exemption, then they would need to do good manufacturing practices. And the second part, the risk assessment part, the hazard analysis, that is, in short, they call it HARPC. So in a nutshell, obviously, we teach this legislation for a 2.5-day workshop, but just in a nutshell, giving the overview of the legislation. Good manufacturing practices, these are relatively easy for food companies to meet these requirements. In my knowledge, based on my experience with the stakeholders, pretty much almost all the food companies, they are having these requirements in their companies. For example, they would need to have very specific sanitation procedures, pre-op procedures, post-op procedures, and then a procedure for the middle of the shift after 4 hours. And then there are specific requirements for training their employee. There are very specific information for environmental monitoring. For example, they would need to test for Listeria monocytogenes if it is a ready-to-eat company. And also they would need to have a recall plan. And obviously that means they would need to have a written document to show that they are capable of taking back their product from the market in case something happens in their company, in case there is an outbreak. And then they would need to have a specific allergen control and allergen labeling. There are 7 different classes of allergens that they would need to make sure they are controlling in their operation and they are labeling their products properly. And then they would need to do supplier verification, and also when it goes to transportation, there are specific requirements. So all these requirements are under the good manufacturing practices. So companies that are exempt, the companies that are receiving modified exemption, all they would need to do is just to follow these requirements. But those companies that are not exempt, in addition to good manufacturing practices, they would need to follow these requirements. These requirements are very similar to the HACCP requirement in the meat industry, or the HACCP requirements, and that is very common in international comments in Codex Alimentarius. In short, this legislation divide HARPC into 5 different categories. And obviously this is a 2.5-day workshop. I'm going to teach one of these workshops next month in case some of our great food manufacturers are interested to join us. But in a nutshell, food companies would need to do a hazard analysis. And based on hazard analysis, they would need to come up with preventive controls. And then for those specific preventive controls, it might be 1 or 2 preventive controls, it might be 5, 6, 7 preventive control in one operation. For those specific preventive controls, they would need to come up with a monitoring, and then they would need to come up with the corrective actions in case their monitoring fails, in case they are not controlling those preventive controls. They would need to come up with a monitoring program. And then they would need to come up with the verification and record keeping procedures. Again, there are very specific requirements, and for 2.5 days, we discussed them in details for the food companies and for our graduate students to make sure they are receiving a certificate. And those who are coming to the certificate, they receive a title. This is, in short, they become PCQI, and this is the regulatory requirement. Every food company in this country, if they are under the legislation of Food Safety Modernization Act, they would need to have at least 1 PCQI. And in order to be a PCQI, one way of receiving this status is coming to one of our workshops. The other is by experience. If they have 30, 40, 50 years of experience in the food industry, they could apply and become a PCQI, and then they don't need to come for the certification program. But for less experienced individuals, the only way they could become a PCQI is joining one of our training programs. And this legislation was implemented in 2015. And as we mentioned, there are a specific requirement to receive exemption. If companies are making less than $500,000 per year and they are selling their product directly to restaurants or directly to consumers within 275 miles, or if they are selling their product only in one state, in their own state, and within 275 miles of their operation, all they would need to do is just to follow the requirement of good manufacturing practices. Rest of the companies, they would need to follow HARPC and good manufacturing practices. And for companies who are making less than $2.5 million, and this is average sale in 3 years, and they had 3 years to meet the requirements. Pretty much after 2018, and they would need to follow the requirements. So now they are under the legislation of Food Safety Modernization Act. And larger companies, and they had even less time to meet the requirements. So I think it is fair to say now the entire food industry would need to follow the Food Safety Modernization Act, or they would need to follow, if they are in the meat industry, they would need to follow hazard analysis and critical control. Okay, that was a brief overview of Food Safety Modernization Act and also importance of food safety. Thank you again for your time. And if you would need more information from us, especially about food safety and Food Safety Modernization Act, I could be reached by this phone number and also by email address, and I would be enthusiastic to share more information with any of the great farmers and also food companies in the region about Food Safety Modernization Act and also food safety in general. Thank you for your time, and it was a great pleasure having you listening to my presentation. Thank you.